All right. I would love for Greg Pod to unmute, and you're going to be up on the screen in just a moment. He was instrumental in helping us to invite General Secretary Hewko to the club today. He is a trustee for the Rotary International Foundation, and there he is. Hi, Greg.
Good morning, good afternoon.
You're coming in just a second. I can see you. Are you good? Can you? Perfect. You're perfect. We can all see you, and we can hear you too.
Good. Thank you.
So in just a second, as you talk, we're probably going to put up a speaker slide up in addition to you so that people can see a little bit about General Secretary's background. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Cassidy. And welcome. It's good to be here. And I also want to thank my my good friend, Mike Brady, for the honor of being with this great Boulder Rotary Club today and introducing your very special speaker. I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person, but I've opted to be in Arizona to stay a little bit warmer. This afternoon, I have the great honor and privilege of introducing an individual I truly admire and truly respect. Your speaker today has been the General Secretary and Chief Executive Officer of Rotary International and our Rotary Foundation since July 1 of 2011. John holds a law degree from Harvard University, a master's in modern history from Oxford University, where he studied as a Marshall Scholar, and a bachelor's in government and Soviet studies from Hamilton College in New York. Prior to joining Rotary, John was an international partner with the law firm of Baker and McKenzie, specializing in international corporate transactions and emerging markets. He helped establish the firm's Moscow office and was managing partner of its office in Ukraine and Prague. From 2004 to 2009, John was the vice president for the operations and compact development for Millennial Challenge Corporation, a United States government agency established in 2004 to deliver foreign assistance to the world's poorest countries. During his tenure, he completed the negotiation of assistance agreements totaling $6.3 billion to 18 countries for infrastructure, agriculture, water, sanitation, health, and educational projects. As the Chief Executive Officer, John leads a very diverse staff of over 800 individuals at our world headquarters in Evanston and our international offices. John and his incredible wife, Marga, are not only both Rotarians and Paul Harris Fellows, but this very special couple is, I'm very proud to say, are great friends of my wife, Pam, and I. Will you please give a very warm Colorado welcome to not only the General Secretary and Chief Executive Officer of Rotary International, but our Rotary Foundation, Mr. John Hewko.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, for that, I would say, overly generous welcome. President Cassidy, thank you for the invitation to be with you this afternoon with the Boulder Rotary Club. Andriu, Romane, Pravit, great to see you again, and great to see so many other great Rotary friends here, certainly virtually. Great to be with you again. Thank you so much for that invitation. You know, I several weeks ago I had the pleasure of attending the Rotary Zone Institute in Salt Lake City, and the theme of that institute was Trails to Peace, and I thought that theme was extremely relevant and important for two reasons. First, as you're all aware, peace and peace building is an integral part of Rotary. It's part of our DNA, part of our history. Whether it was the work of the 45 Rotarians who participated in the various working groups and delegations in drafting the UN Charter in 1945, our role in establishing UNESCO, our Peace Fellows program, the work we do in our 7 areas of focus, again, our promotion of the concept of positive peace, our youth exchange programs, all the different things we as Rotarians do to bring people together from around the world. I think all of this represents really one of our organization's core values and mission. And secondly, I think that focus on peace is even more important today, because the world is, I would say, anything but peaceful. And I would say the world today needs peace building and our unique ability to help in that effort more than ever. We see our country, the United States, is highly divided and polarized. We see terrible conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and other places. And then, of course, for the past 9 months, we've seen the really brutal and horrific, unprovoked war that Russia has unleashed on Ukraine. And so you've asked me to share with you today really an update on Rotary's relief efforts in Ukraine, and my thoughts, and in some ways my personal story with respect to Ukraine and the future role that Rotary can play in Ukraine and the region beyond, in Ukraine and the region, sort of really beyond disaster relief once this terrible war has concluded. So first, I thought it might be helpful to summarize how horrific this war really is, the scale of which we haven't seen in Europe, at least since the Second World War. And of course, with the fog of war, it's always difficult to get information that's 100% reliable. But certainly General Milley, chair of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, recently came out with a statement that certainly Pentagon's estimating at least 100,000 Ukrainian and 100,000 Russian soldiers have been either died or wounded. He also indicated that perhaps as many as 40,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed or injured, which is certainly a much higher number from what has been previously reported. There have been almost 6,000 missile strikes on Ukraine, many of them, in fact, most of them on purely civilian targets. Been almost 9,000 air raid warnings across the countries. And personally, I still have a great deal of family and friends and former colleagues in Ukraine, and there have been many occasions when I'm talking to them by phone, and we have to stop the conversation because the air raid sirens have gone off, and they need to go to the bomb shelters. And then, of course, starting in early November, Russia began a series of unprecedented rocket attacks on the Ukrainian power grid, destroying probably close to 50% of the grid and plunging millions of innocent civilians into darkness and without heat, electricity and water as the tough Ukrainian winter approaches. Literally hundreds of billions of dollars of civilian infrastructure has been destroyed, including 800,000 homes, 135,000 civilian buildings, over 1,000 hospitals and medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed. And there's 170,000 kilometers of land that will need to be demined from the Russian mines. The estimate for what it will cost to rebuild Ukraine ranges as high as $1 trillion. There's 7 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe and elsewhere, another 6 million who are internally displaced. And I think if we sort of put this all into context, it took 4 years for a million Syrian refugees to come into Europe. And in the Ukraine conflict, 13 million people were on the move in a matter of days. And of course, if the heating situation, with electricity, the water, the gas situation in Ukraine continues to get worse, and there's no indication that it will get better as Putin continues to double down on literally destroying the country and taking it back into the Stone Ages, we could see another huge wave of refugees fleeing, simply to avoid freezing to death. I mean, we have 40-some million Ukrainians that are in danger of literally freezing to death. And of course, what Putin and Russia are doing in Ukraine is rippling across the globe. We have, significant food shortages in many of the world's poorest countries because of Ukraine's inability to fully export its grain. Food prices have exploded, and it's causing, again, mass hunger in many of the world's poorest countries. And it really affects. It's very difficult for us sitting in the comfort here in the West to in some ways to fully appreciate what they're going through. No electricity means no cancer treatment for people. Surgeons operating with on candlelight. People that need dialysis. I was in Portugal this summer and met with a large group of Ukrainian refugees, and there was a mother that I was speaking with whose child needs cancer treatment and was not able. They're fleeing. They're not able to get it. The mother was crying, just desperate for getting treatment for her child. And thankfully, the Rotarians in Portugal stepped up and were able to arrange for her son to get that sort of treatment. Mass looting of Ukraine's cultural artifacts. You've all read about the reports from Kherson, the city that Ukraine recently liberated, where 10,000, almost an entire museum of Ukrainian historical artifacts were looted and taken back to Russia. And so, for me, the most horrific aspect of all of this is really the kind of the mass looting, the raping, the summary executions, the wanton destruction, and literally the thousands of war crimes being committed by the Russians on a daily basis. And we see the news of the torture chambers, the mass graves in Bucha, Irpin, Izium, many other liberated towns. And for me, the truly horrific fact is that, in my view, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And I have no doubt that we will all be literally stunned at the actual figures once this war is over and all of the Russian war crimes have been uncovered and investigated. So personally, as I look at all this death and destruction, I ask myself really the simple question, and for what? And for what? For what? And so I think in the face of this incredible human tragedy, I think Rotary has responded as really one would expect we would as Rotarians. Shortly after the war began, we put together a Ukrainian disaster response fund at the Rotary Foundation, and really within a matter of weeks and in a few short months, Rotarians from around the world contributed $15 million to that fund, which was really an unprecedented response by our members. And that fund has now been exhausted. All that money has now been spent on Ukrainian relief efforts. I'm particularly proud and really amazed at our Rotarians in Ukraine, where many of our Rotarians have had to flee, have had to send their families abroad, have lost their businesses, have lost their homes, have been displaced. And yet, in the face of this horrific war that's unfolding, they continue to meet, they continue to do great works. And the way we utilized part of the money, the 15 million, we opened up 3 streams of grants of $100,000 each to the Ukrainian Rotary District, and once they spent three streams of 100,000 each. Once they spent the money in each stream, we would replenish it with a further 100,000. And they used one stream for medicines and medical supplies and equipment. They used another stream for ambulances and for fire equipment, and then very cleverly they used the third stream to provide sub-grants to the Rotary Clubs in Ukraine. We have about 60-some clubs in Ukraine, 1,200 Rotarians, and they wanted to make sure each club in Ukraine was doing something. And so each club was able to tap into that third stream for locally based relief efforts. And I think what's most extraordinary and really is a sign of how important it is for us as Rotarians to engage in our communities, to show local impact, is the fact that Rotary membership in Ukraine has actually increased since the war started, because people see the extraordinary great works that our Rotarians are doing. But I think that 15 million that we raised through the Rotary Foundation, which unfortunately now has all been spent, I would suspect, and we're hearing anecdotally, there's probably another 15 to perhaps 20 million that is not coming through our Rotary Foundation, where clubs and districts are raising money and sending it directly to Ukraine, or working directly with Ukrainian refugees in their local communities. So I think we can probably say fairly safely that our organization has really stepped up over the last 9 months and probably provided somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $35 million worth of relief to Ukraine since the war started, which is really an extraordinary effort. And as a small aside, I know we have Greg Potter, a trustee, on the call. Greg, I do think we need to, in my view, reopen the Ukraine Fund, because there's still a tremendous amount of interest by Rotarians here. Many are reaching out to me and saying we've raised 30, 20, 30, whatever $1,000 for Ukraine. We want to make sure it goes to Ukraine. But since the Disaster Response Fund has now been closed for Ukraine, we were going to be sent. So the foundation is losing a significant amount of potential revenues by incentivizing people not to give to the foundation, but to go directly to Ukraine with their aid. It gets to Ukraine eventually, but it'd be great if we could circulate it through the foundation. But that's something I'm going to be raising with the trustees, because I do believe we need to reopen that fund. So again, we've had an incredible response by our Rotarians. I think all of us as Rotarians can be extremely proud. And please do continue, if your clubs and districts are interested in continuing to help, please continue to help Ukraine, because the situation is only going to get worse. We've just seen the tip of the iceberg. We still got a good four months of really harsh, difficult weather in Ukraine. And we really are perhaps witnessing the first time in history where a country, Russia, is attempting to literally starve, freeze to death a population of over 40 million people. And all of this is, of course, very personal to me. As in the case of Andy and Roman, who are with us. My parents are from Ukraine. They came to the States in 1949 after the Second World War, having spent 4 years in a refugee camp in southern Germany after they fled Ukraine. I grew up speaking Ukrainian at home, and my wife Margaret and I, we lived in Ukraine from 91 to 96, where I was working in the Ukrainian parliament and then practicing law, running the firm I was with. I was running their office in Ukraine. And as I mentioned earlier, still have a great deal of family and friends and former colleagues there. And again, the stories you hear of the resilience of the people, the suffering, but in the face of that suffering, to carry on, the concerts in the metro stations, the creativity of the Ukrainians, and the resilience and the spirit that they've shown in the face of this incredible war is really quite amazing, and an example for the rest of the world. And so and as I mentioned, all of us, I think we should be extremely proud of Rotary. That's what we're all about as an organization: stepping up in the time of need, adapting, springing into action, using our local presence and our global footprint to make a difference, saving lives, providing hope. So again, thanks to all of you for what you do and will continue to be doing for Ukraine. I know many of you some of you have traveled to Poland, Ukraine, other countries to help, and please know that it is making a huge difference. And so this leads me really to the second portion of my comments. What's next? And what will Rotary's role be in that next phase of Ukraine, the war, and then in terms of the Ukrainian reconstruction effort, which is going to be massive? And I think to answer that question, I think it'd be useful to give some historical perspective on where Ukraine has come from and where it needs to go. But also to realize that I think any one of us can, given the right circumstances and serendipity, make a meaningful difference and contribute, even in a small way, to a country's future and history. Over the last 500 years have been many key moments in Ukraine's history, but I think there are sort of 6 that stand out in my mind. I won't go over all 6, but I would like to start with the fourth sort of key milestone in Ukrainian history. And I sort of go back to a personal story. My wife, Marga, is from Argentina. We were married in Santa Fe in December of 1989 in Santa Fe, Argentina. And we, a week later, 2 weeks after our marriage, we moved to Moscow. And so I like to say that Marga was probably the first and last Argentine in history to take her honeymoon in Moscow. in the middle of January. We were there for about a year and a half, and then in the spring of 1991, we moved to Ukraine. I had George Soros, the very well-known philanthropist, was funding the creation of an advisory council to the Ukrainian parliament. And this was still the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union hadn't happened yet. Ukraine was still part of the USSR, but he had formed a advisory group of really well-known Western politicians, economists, academics to advise the Ukrainian parliament. And I took a leave of absence from the firm I was with, moved to Ukraine for a year to work in the parliament as a legal advisor. And as you're aware, the coup in Moscow that really led to the end of the Soviet Union took place on August 19th, 1991. The day before that coup, I was in a town, city called Zaporizhia, at a rock concert. There was a series of these sort of really avant-garde rock concerts that were taking place throughout Ukraine at the time. And Marga and I went to Zaporizhia for the concert, which took place on the 18th. And Zaporizhia is, of course, in the news now because that's where that nuclear power plant is that the Russians have occupied and are putting the entire world at danger of a nuclear explosion. But I remember that evening, that day, walking along the river, the Dnipro River, with a Ukrainian friend, and I mentioned him. I go, I can't believe this. Here I am, son of what the Soviets used to call bourgeois nationalists, freely talking to you, working in the Ukrainian parliament with my ID, able to go in and out of these government buildings. There has to be a counter-revolution. There has to be a counter-revolution. I can't imagine they're going to, the hardliners are going to allow this to continue. So that night we flew back to Kyiv, and the next morning at 7 in the morning, my friend Alexei calls me, says, "John, you remember what we talked about last night?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Turn on the TV." And sure enough, the coup had taken place in Moscow. And so I headed over to the Parliament building and spent the entire 4 days of the coup in the Parliament building. And of course, on the 21st, 2 days later, Boris Yeltsin got up on the tank in front of the White House in Moscow, and that effectively was the beginning of the end of the coup. And so Andy Warhol has a saying that everybody has their 15 minutes in the sun, and that sort of led to my sort of 15 minutes of quasi-fame. At that time, and the coup happened, the Ukrainian parliament was out of session. And when it became clear that the coup was going to fail, the Ukrainians called a meeting of the parliament for the 24th of August. And on the night of the 23rd, the Democratic opposition in the Ukrainian parliament got together on the third floor of the parliament building to figure out how they were going to react to the events that had happened in Moscow, and what was going to be their position and their strategy the next day when Ukrainian parliament was going to convene. And at that time, the Democratic opposition had about 25% of the deputies in the parliament. The communists had about 75%. And so a huge debate broke out among the Democratic faction in terms of what to do the next day. There was one group that said, let's go for independence. This is to seize the moment, go for independence. And another group said, well, let's wait. We don't want to be independent, have an independent Ukraine, but led by the communists, because the communists still controlled the government and the parliament. And so for me, it was sort of like being in Philadelphia on July 3rd, 1776, and listening to all these debates between, Jefferson and Madison and all the, Hancock and all the drafters of the Declaration of Independence. And in the end, they had a huge debate. And in the end, they decided to try to declare independence, try to, get the parliament to declare independence the next day. So they started drafting all these different decrees and resolutions that they wanted Parliament to adopt the next day, banning the Communist Party, nationalizing Communist Party property. A couple of political prisoners were being held. They wanted them released, etc. And as they started finishing drafting these resolutions, sort of late in the evening, one of the deputies comes up to me and says, "John, we've got a real problem because," and I said, "What is it?" He says, "We have no way of photocopying these things so that we can bring them forth at the parliamentary session tomorrow and have the deputies vote on it." I said, "Well, why don't you just go to the secretariat?" And at that time, it was very hard to get photocopy machines, but there was one in the secretariat. I said, "Why don't we, give it to the secretariat? They'll do it for you." And they said, "No, the communists control the secretariat. They'll never photocopy these for us." And I had a tiny little Canon PC7 copier, and Marga, my wife, had just brought a box of A4 paper from Moscow. And so I said, "Well, give me those decrees and I'll copy them for you." And so with a student from the university, we spent all night making 435 copies of each of those decrees, and I had to put 4 on each page because we didn't have enough paper to have one piece of paper per decree. And then so we worked all evening, and then at 7 in the morning, next morning, I take this box of all this stuff, I deliver it to the deputy head of the opposition. Communists freak out, where did all this stuff come from? And 6 hours later, Ukraine declared independence. Now, I suspect they would have declared independence anyhow, but certainly having all those decrees to actually be able to vote on something and to have it for the deputies helped. And I like to think that I and that little PC7 copier had a small role to play in ensuring Ukraine's independence, my sort of 15 minutes of fame. But I think it does show that in the right circumstances, with a little bit of luck, with a little bit of serendipity, one person can have, albeit a small influence on the course of a country's history. And so Ukraine became independent. All the oblasts, all the provinces, regions in Ukraine voted for independence. Even Crimea, it was about 52%, if I'm not mistaken, in Crimea. Small majority, but a majority of the people did vote for independence, and throughout the rest of the country, significant majorities voted for independence. And then, of course, Ukraine's history since then has been a sort of a difficult and rocky one. Obviously, the Soviet legacy was extremely difficult to overcome. From independence to today, it's been a difficult road. Issues of corruption, issues of dismantling the Soviet system, issues of oligarchs dominating the economy. But to the Ukrainians' credit, it has been a slow and steady evolution. And what's ironic in all of this, in all of Putin's efforts, is that he, perhaps more than anyone, has done more to accelerate the creation of a Ukrainian nation, because at the time Ukraine became independent in 91, it was still a relatively divided country. Catholic and Ukrainian-speaking West, Orthodox and predominantly Russian-speaking East, significant historical differences between Western and Eastern and Central Ukraine. It was still not a fully formed nation from a spiritual and from an emotional and from a national feeling perspective. And it was really Putin, perhaps more than any single individual, who accelerated all that. If you look at, with the invasion of Crimea in 2014, with the Maidan revolution, every step that Putin has taken since then has completely backfired, and has led to an increased strengthening of Ukrainian national consciousness, an increased strengthening of Ukrainian unity, et cetera, et cetera. And so with this war, he's in effect allowed Ukraine, as terrible and tragic as it's been, to take, in my view, the penultimate step in its evolution as a country, has united Ukraine as never before. And what's really ironic is, if you look at the cities that he's destroying, the areas that he's completely demolishing and trashing, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Mariupol, that city that's now literally looks like Dresden after the Second World War. These are all predominantly Russian-speaking cities that had a sort of, relatively positive outlook toward Russia, many with relatives in Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So the people that he's purportedly invaded to save are the ones that he's literally killing, destroying, and certainly destroying their cities. And of course, it's put Ukraine firmly on the map. Everybody now knows about Ukraine, where it is, huge interest in Ukrainian history, et cetera. And so our actions as Rotarians, your support, are really contributing to the building of the Ukrainian nation, because without people, there really is no nation. But what's happening now, this unification that's occurred because of this war, and all this backfiring that's occurring because of what Putin has done, his miscalculations, is really, in my view, an important step in Ukraine's development as a country. But it's the penultimate state. It's the penultimate state, because there still is one phase left, and that is the Ukrainian reconstruction effort that's going to have to happen after this war. And when I talk about the reconstruction, it's not just about the country's infrastructure. It's about rooting out corruption. It's about destroying the oligarchic system that existed there in terms of the economics. Because, prior to the war, there were still significant issues in Ukraine. It had come a long way. It had turned to the West fairly aggressively, especially after Maidan in 2014. But there's still issues of rule of law. There's still significant issues of corruption. There's still significant issues of a judicial system that was not up to par. And then the whole issue of the oligarchs dominating the economy. And that hasn't kind of gone away. And so as we enter into this, what I would call the sixth and last phase of Ukraine's development as a country and as a nation, this reconstruction and the vast sums of money that are going to be coming into Ukraine, this is the historic moment for Ukraine to finally root out that corruption, deal with the oligarchic system, put in place a judicial system, and deal with the rule of law issues, and really set it on a course for true European path, true European orientation. And here, EU accession is going to be extremely important. I was practicing law in the Czech Republic in the years prior to them becoming formal members of the European Union. And the conditions of EU accession are pretty tough. And I could really see how the drive to join the EU accelerated significantly reform efforts in the Czech Republic. And similarly, I think EU accession is going to be extraordinarily important as a carrot, as an incentive for Ukraine to take those final last steps and deal with these issues of corruption, rule of law, the judiciary, the oligarchs, etc. But the carrot of EU accession has to be realistic. You have people like Macron talking about decades. Well, that's too long. Ukraine is going to lose momentum. So when this war ends and the money starts pouring in, we need to give Ukraine a realistic but a tough road toward, in terms of strict requirements to join the EU, but also, in my view, to use those reconstruction funds. Be very generous, but also be very tough. And toughness meaning to really obligate the Ukrainians to, once and for all, deal with some of these underlying structural issues that the country is facing, to really to allow it to take that last step to becoming not only a unified country, but also become a truly European country. And so here I think we again come full circle to Rotary, because I think we can play an important role in Ukraine's reconstruction. Civil society is going to play a huge role in the Ukrainian rebuilding effort, and particularly in these anti-corruption efforts. The one thing Ukraine does have is a very strong civil society, and we in Rotary are very strong in Ukraine. So we had a pretty important role to play now, in terms of helping with these immediate needs. But once the war ends and Ukraine begins reconstructing and taking that final path toward to joining the EU and becoming a fully integrated country into the European structures, I think we can play a huge role, not only in the reconstruction, but in the efforts of turning the country around and joining the other civil society groups in Ukraine as watchdogs, as oversight, and as a force for pushing Ukraine to take that final step in its development as a country. So again, thanks to all of you and those that helped Ukraine. Thanks to Rotarians around the world. And two additional things I just would like to, or one additional thing I'd like to add. We now have in Rotary a formal relationship with something called Welcome.us, which is a bipartisan organization which was created initially to help integrate Afghan refugees into the United States. It provides, and it's now really expanded to include the Ukrainian refugees. Welcome.us has all kinds of resources on how to become a sponsor for families, for refugee families coming to the United States. There's a stipend that sponsoring families can get from Welcome, etc. We've seen a lot of Rotarians take the initiative and work with Welcome to accept refugees into their homes. So if you are interested in sponsoring Ukrainian or an Afghan or any refugee family, Welcome.us, urge you to reach out to them. And again, Rotary, we do now have a formal relationship with them and are working on those issues. So again, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, and happy to take any questions or comments or suggestions that you might have. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Does that work with your time frame?
Sure. No, happy to.
Awesome. So what we're going to do, we have a Zoom audience and an in-person audience, and we'll go back and forth. And I ask everybody to be cognizant of time. So if you have a question, ask a question, and we'll go. Does anybody have a question for General Secretary? John. Yay.
John, my name is John Kotke. I'm a past president of this club. The first thing I want to say is my wife, who's also a past president of this club, when we were coming to this meeting, I said, we were just saying we could not ask for a better CEO president of Rotary International than you at this point in time. I mean, you're absolutely phenomenal with your background and everything else. And I just want to thank you for your service to Rotary. It's just phenomenal. My question is, again, we all want this horrible Ukrainian war to end as soon as possible. And I would just like to hear your thoughts on, is it, again, I understand what President Zelensky has said many times, that we need to go back to our historical borders. My wife and I had an opportunity to visit Ukraine when Crimea was still a part of Ukraine, and we traveled around that part of Ukraine as well. Do you see that as being a kind of stopper in this whole possibility of reaching a resolution?
Yeah. Well, I think my personal view is Ukraine has to win the war. And in a second, I'll tell you what my sense of what winning means. And it has to win the war for two reasons. One is because it was invaded unprovoked, and it deserves to get its country back. But also, and again, I'm speaking now personally, I'm not as Rotary's general secretary, it's my own personal opinion, is that Russia as a society, the Germans after the Second World War had a really deep-seated, look in the mirror. And as a society, they stepped back and said, how did we, as a German people, allow what happened in World War II to happen? Never again. And as a society, they had a reckoning. They looked in the mirror, and they really changed. That's never happened in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. In fact, many in Russia were kind of still continue making. Well, we were the real victims in the Soviet Union, and there was never sort of a reckoning of the role that the Russians may have played in history, a sort of a negative role, so to speak. And so it's only, I think, through losing this war will that force Russian society, in my view, to have to look in the mirror and step back and say, how is it that we, as a Russian people, put in place a government that launches an unprovoked war against a fellow Slavic neighbor, and that commits all of these atrocities that I outlined, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, in the beginning of my comments. So in my view, it's just not simply Ukraine winning because they deserve to win and they deserve to get their country back, but also not just because it's in terms of reestablishing the international order and establishing the principle that you can't walk into a neighboring country and level it because you have some kind of messianic historic vision of what your own country should look like, but also to force that sort of rethinking by the Russians of themselves as a society, as a people, as a body politic. Now, what does winning mean? In my view, personally, it's at least to get back to the February borders. Crimea, the DNR, the LNR, those are a little bit more problematic. And I personally, and this is just my personal view, I'd take that deal. If you can at least push the Russians back to the pre-February borders, get security guarantees, get Ukraine to join NATO, and then get the use of the frozen Russian assets toward the rebuilding effort, plus a Marshall-type plan for Ukraine. That personally, for me, would be a situation that I think would be a huge win for Ukraine. But it's going to be very difficult because, obviously, many in Ukrainian society that say, well, Crimea was Ukraine, and those 2014 territories in Donetsk and Luhansk, which were occupied, that's Ukraine, and why should we have to give it up because some guy decided to come in and try to recreate this Russian world that he sort of has in his fantasy mind. But Ukraine has to win the war. I think that would be absolutely tragic if we pulled the rug out from under Ukraine and threw them under the bus and forced them into some kind of a peace that would not be fair and just.
Great. We have one more question. Thank you.
Hi, John. Thank you again for your time today. I note that there's like 127 Rotary clubs within Russian borders, within Russia. Is there a role that those clubs can play in kind of helping create a bridge to peace, or is there any communication between those clubs and Rotary International now? Like, I'm just curious if there's any kind of.
Well, I think we have about 1,100 Rotarians in Russia. It's a difficult time for them now because they're living in a dictatorship where if you mention the word, it's a war, not a special military operation, you got 15 years in jail potentially. So they're obviously living in a society, a difficult place. But yes, I do think that that the Rotarians in Russia, I would in fact say, have an obligation to play a strong role in these peace building efforts that are going to be needed after the war ends, because you have now an entire generation of Ukrainians who've lived through all this, who, it's going to take multiple generations, I think, to overcome the bitterness and the hatred that the Ukrainians have, in my view, justifiably so, against Russia. So I very much hope that when this war is over and there's more freedom to act on the part of the Russian Rotarians, that they step up and play together with the Rotarians in Ukraine a constructive effort in trying to build better peace and understanding among those two countries for the long term. But it's going to be very difficult. I mean, the amount of destruction and death and the suffering that Ukrainians have endured, it's going to take a long time for those peace channels to be established and to become effective.
Thank you so much, John. We have one last thing to talk to you about, and then we will let you get on with your very awesome work. And before we even say goodbye, I want to let you know that one of our club's goals in our visioning last year was to help the people of Ukraine. So you said earlier, hey, Greg, let's think about keeping that fund open. I can tell you that there's a great interest in making sure that the people who've been dispersed, the people who are in need of medical aid, we're greatly interested in helping them.
Well, John, one of the traditions in our club is the club gets the last word, and I've been selected to have the last word, and I don't know where to begin. I was a little late. I first started working on the reform issues in Ukraine back in 1993, and have continued to work there. Like you, I try and talk to folks in Ukraine, and the lights go out in the middle of a Zoom call this morning. So I understand what's going on, and I'd love to sit down for a couple hours over a beer and talk to you about it. But I'd like to talk a little bit about what this club and District 5450 is doing. I know you were out here for the Humanity Challenge and visited with Doug Jackson and Project Cure. And District 5450 is in the process of putting together a program with Project Cure to help move medical supplies and equipment into Ukraine, hopefully in some fairly large numbers. I know there are Rotarians here from other clubs in District 450 and on the Zoom call who have done many projects in Ukraine, and District 5450, I can tell you, will stay on board and will stay the course. And when it comes to staying the course, one other thing that you obviously know probably as much as anybody about is the Polio Plus Challenge. And one of the other traditions in our club is when we have speakers, we talk to them about the Polio Plus Challenge, and we, in their honor, donate 100 doses of polio vaccine to the Polio Plus Challenge. So in your honor, we are donating 100 doses of the polio vaccine to the Polio Plus Challenge. And we have a certificate that we'll figure out a way to get to you, either through Rotary channels or maybe just the U.S. Postal Service. But in any event,
I was thinking mail.
In any event, we want to thank you so much for all the work you've done. I won't belabor the point because we all know it. We appreciate everything you do for Rotary and everything you're doing for Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
1 2 1 2. Mic check. Hey, can y'all hear me out there? You Ukraine on the set, bang. Against all odds, 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 against all odds. Let it breathe. England, where you at? Where you at? Shit. London, where you at? Where you at? Where you at? Paris, France, Wales, Scotland, Nitro, let's go. Hard work wins, leaders don't follow. Living for today, might not be here tomorrow. Welcome to the team, we wish you all the best. Now and in the future, look what we doing next. Against all odds, against all odds, we show them how to do it. Against all odds, against all odds, hard work to get you through it. What you got? Determination. What else? Big dreams, real goals. We achieving things. We stay together. Come and walk with us. True. You wanna do some business? Come and talk to us. This like truth or dare. Call it a win-win. We on a journey. Take it back to where the show began. Together we are stronger. Y'all stay safe.